Hi everyone, my name is John Anaja. I'm a program manager on the Visual Basic compiler team, and today I want to talk to you about a new feature coming in Visual Basic 10 called auto-implemented properties.
Let's go over to Visual Studio here, and we've got a customer class and an order class. And we're going to create some properties to express some state on our objects, and we're going to look at how we would do that in Visual Basic 2008, and then how we would do it in Visual Basic 2010. So in Visual Basic 2008, I can use the property snippet, press tab twice, come over here, tab along, and enter name as string. I'm going to right click and hit hide snippet highlighting. And I'm also going to make a property, and we'll call this one underscore phone numbers. And we'll say it's a list of string. And then that's going to be phone numbers. Now, if we look at what we've actually created here, we have something like 25 lines of code that expresses two very simple concepts. We have a name property and a phone numbers property. And everything else is just a whole bunch of syntax we had to type to tell the compiler to complete the property. And this is the type of thing that the compiler can be helping us with a lot more. You know, it's pretty obvious that for average mainline properties, you want a backing field, you want the getter to return it, you want the setter to set it. So why do we need to type out 11 lines of code per property for what could easily be one line? So what VB10 is going to allow us to do is to actually declare this in one line. Public property name as string. Public property phone numbers as list of string. And so now in 2 lines, we're telling the compiler exactly what we want done, and it can go figure out to generate the getter, generate the setter, and to generate the backing field. Also, the parens themselves are actually optional as well. Now, when we had access to the backing field itself, we could say, private underscore name equals, or none or something like that by default. We could specify a default value when we had control of the backing field. But now that the compiler is declaring the backing field for us, it gets harder to set an initial value. And typically this initial value would actually get set when the constructor for your class runs. So what we did is we added an initializers feature to auto-implemented properties. So you can say public property name as string equals, and now you can say any value. And then when the constructor from your class runs, your default value will be set. This is often very useful when you have entity classes and you want to represent that if you have a database assigned primary key, you might want to use the value -1 to signal that your entity has not been saved yet. So here we can say property ID as integer equals -1. Now we have the equal syntax, so let's look at how that would apply to a reference type. Let's say I wanted to do something like property order list as list of order equals new list of order. And this will do what we expect, just like the string case. When the constructor runs, the list will be initialized. But it kind of feels a bit un-VB-like to have to say list of order twice, because VB has always supported a syntax, like for variable declarations, I can say dim mylist as new list of order. And so we wanted to bring that same feel to properties and not have to list the type twice. Just eke out a little bit more productivity there. So properties also now support the as new syntax, as new list of order. And now when the constructor runs, this will initialize the list to be a new list of order. Now another new feature in VB10 is called collection initializers. And they have an interesting intersection point with auto-implemented properties with this as new syntax. Because you can now actually say as new list of order, and now in IntelliSense we see this keyword from. From is the keyword used to make a collection initializer in Visual Basic 10. So when I say from, I'm going to open a squiggly brace, I'm going to press enter. I'm just going to tab over here, and now I can actually initialize it with default elements. So we'll say new order with, we'll say .id equals 1, new order with, .id equals 14. And now in one line, we're actually able to create a list of orders, initialize it to default values, and what's even better on top of this is we also see implicit line continuation. In Visual Basic 9.0, we would need to have an underscore here, here, and here. But now due to implicit line continuation, which you'll see in another video, we don't need to do this anymore. So that's an example of how auto-implemented properties really allow you to get a lot more done in fewer lines of code. Now, what if you really do want to get your expanded properties? Let's say you have more complicated validation logic or things happening in your properties. You can still do that by pressing Property and then just tabbing twice, and you'll still get the snippet insertion. Or you could say something like, property fax number as string. And if you type get on the next line and press enter, we'll still spit the property definition for you, and you can go ahead and code it just like you would have had in Visual Basic 9.0. One question we often see when people see this new syntax is, well, why wouldn't I just use a field instead? So let's look at that case. Let's say public name2 as string equals none. And the only difference between these two lines is property. But there's often a good reason to actually make this a property rather than a public field. It's actually an FX cop error to expose public fields if you're using the code analysis tools, and for good reason. One of the reasons you'd want to use a property over a field is you can't enforce the existence of a field through an interface, but you can enforce the existence of a property. Probably a more common reason would be if you're using data binding. If you're binding your class to a data grid or something like that, it'll bind to properties, but it won't bind to fields. There's other reasons in terms of serialization and breaking change when going from a field to a property and things like that. Reflection as well, where you would want to use a property rather than a field. I think data binding would be the biggest one. And so now we've made the property experience as easy as it is for fields. So we've seen how auto-implemented properties reduce the amount of code that we need to type. We've seen how we can initialize them to default values. We've seen the as-new syntax. We've seen how they intersect with collection initializers. And we've seen some of the IDE support for still getting the expanded property syntax when we need that. So you can try this out in Visual Studio 2010 Beta 2. And let us know your feedback on Connect and on the forums and on the Visual Basic team blog. Thanks.